sector. But I think this is a useful starting place to pick out maybe 3 ideas that will come through in my talk. I like to start with this because there's a sort of, I don't know, men of a certain age quality to it, except not in our 50s, but in our 30s. So I grew up playing the computer games that Sony Studios Liverpool produced, particularly Lemmings. I was a big fan of. I kind of lost hours of my youth playing that. And what happened was Sony Studios in Liverpool was closed by Sony, basically because of shifts in the kind of landscape of computer game production, particularly away from sort of hardware-based computer game consumption to much more kind of app-based iPhone and iPad or smartphone style games that weren't made in big studios. And the sort of story we could tell about this is really a story of kind of economics, about changes in business models and changes in economic value. But interestingly, the artifacts that were produced by Sony Studios Liverpool, and to kind of immediately make them academic to call them artifacts, were exhibited in 2 exhibitions that were based in Manchester and then in Woodhorn, which is a place that's kind of just outside Newcastle in the UK, which was a kind of history of computer gaming, particularly focusing on the UK experience. And Wipeout and Lemmings were kind of stars of the show. And it was fascinating to watch what was seen to be a kind of commercial economic activity, I suppose legitimised within museum spaces and turned into kind of celebrations of cultural value as opposed to economic. Underneath that kind of transformation, I suppose, is a story of economic value and a story of cultural value. But there's also a sort of sociological story of kind of my own personal consumption as a young person of these games, the kind of role they played in my life and my kind of evolution, the social networks they created and friendships around playing these games. So we have a kind of sociological story about identity as well. And so we have kind of 3 disciplinary perspectives, economics, perhaps sociology or perhaps cultural studies, and then maybe art history or museology. And these 3 disciplinary perspectives don't fit together particularly well at all. And there are interesting power relationships, which is kind of my question, this is where it comes from, between the 3 disciplinary perspectives, particularly within the kind of art history museology case, because computer games are not the subject of art history. They are sort of very peripheral to the art historical canon, at least, and something that we see in kind of discussions of digital humanities, discussions of the kind of archiving of particularly commercial forms of cultural activity as being in quite kind of serious tension with art history. Thus, we have a kind of personal story that I could tell, a disciplinary story about these different disciplines and their conceptions of value in this tale, but also there is a sort of question of power within disciplines themselves. So how do these kind of disciplinary stories relate to the experience of understanding cultural value in the UK? I think the question of disciplinary power is really important because it's a story that runs through the evolution of British cultural policy, and actually, strictly speaking, I'm talking about English cultural policy, but there are kind of crossovers with the Welsh, Scottish and Northern Irish experience as well, where we see a movement within cultural funding, particularly for mainstream, what we might think of as a kind of elite metropolitan forms of cultural activity, so opera, avant-garde visual arts, theatre, usually grounded in London, as moving from a situation where these things are a sort of unquestioned good wrapped up in the establishment of the British model of arts funding, which is to do with the Arts Council and grows out of the kind of social relationships in the 1940s between people like Keynes and the broader kind of Bloomsbury set of modernists of which he was part, through the challenges of the 1970s, which were both sort of disciplinary challenges within art history and the rise of community and participatory art making and economic challenges as government starts to kind of raise questions about as I'll show you, the economy, efficiency and effectiveness of their funding, and a sort of sociological challenges as the questions around art for art's sake and the assumptions about cultural funding going to elite metropolitan institutions are radically questioned, particularly in terms of the class basis and class relationships implicit in those cultural organisations. By the time we get through the 1980s, which is the period of the explosion of impact assessments around initially understanding the economic impact of arts and cultural funding, through to the 1990s, which is the kind of story of social impacts, particularly the relationship between social policy and the arts, there is a kind of grand dilemma that presents itself to us in the mid-2000s under the new Labour government in the UK around the kind of limits of measuring cultural funding using impact frameworks, but also the necessity of fitting in with broader professionalisation trends that had gone on within the policy process, particularly under new public management, and the kind of demand for, and this wasn't exclusively a kind of new Labour thing, but the demand for positivist forms of social science within policy making, so particularly economics and the kind of role that economics might have in making the world visible and solving the kind of ambivalences of modernity that New Labour felt it was kind of confronting. These, I suppose, dilemmas express themselves in the birth of a debate over the value of culture. The value of culture, or the cultural value debate in the UK, starts to get going in 2003 with a conference that was organised by various cultural organisations and a think tank called Demos in the UK, was kind of taken up by the then Culture Minister, Tessa Jowell, who wrote a pamphlet called Government and the Value of Culture. It manifests itself, should we say, academically through a debate over the intrinsic and instrumental values of culture, and John Holden and Robert Hewison's work about measuring cultural value, and has kind of, I suppose, brought us to the stage where I personally did some work for the UK's Ministry of Culture about how we might fit in these questions of kind of, should we say, art history, sociology and economics into the framework that government uses to make decisions. And AHRC, which is the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, has become very interested in this question of how do we kind of deal with what might be the sort of uniqueness or specialness of culture within a public policy framework that is increasingly, if not dominated, but wants to pay lip service to positivist forms of social science and has professionalised itself around largely economic forms of analysis. So as I say, AHRC have launched this kind of cultural value programme which builds on a lot of these debates. And this kind of question of, I suppose, what's the sort of specialness or what's the kind of uniqueness or difference around arts and cultural funding, it was kind of summed up quite well by Adrian Ellis in 2003 at the conference I mentioned, where he kind of talked about the dilemmas of wanting to preserve what was usually thought about as intrinsic value within the arts and cultural sector, although I have tremendous problems with that particular language. But recognising the kind of governmental regime in which funding was allocated, and funding would be kind of judged as well. The governmental regime that Ellis is talking about, we can go into a bit more detail on, I think, because it's useful to kind of tease out the tensions between, on the one hand, a kind of art historical idea about cultural value, and on the other hand, the sort of central government's positivist economic idea about value. And within central government, broadly, there is a sort of market failure principle that has come to dominate government's conception of what public policy is there to do, and also its conception of how public policy will be made. So if you look at the sort of policy documentation that the UK's Ministry of Culture has about itself and kind of talks about itself, it's talking in terms of a form of professionalised policy making that draws on economics and sees society as kind of coterminous or synonymous with the market, and the justification for public policy making to be done in an open and transparent way by identifying market failures, showing through economic analysis that a government intervention would correct a market failure and would not cause any more harm to the operations of the market than doing nothing at all would. This stop laughing, Paul. This sort of comes through in Treasury discussions, particularly around the kind of guidance that Treasury has about how to do this kind of analysis, how to solve these sort of, as I say, these problems and dilemmas of appearing professional and making policy making accountable and open. And the Treasury talks again in economic terms, using the idea of opportunity cost as a very kind of strong strand of trying to embed thinking that would not think just in terms of wouldn't it be great if we had a new museum, but tries to get policymakers to think in terms of that new museum might be worth a hospital, or that new museum might be worth 2 new art galleries or something like this, and then using the framework of cost-benefit analysis. Now, cost-benefit analysis is kind of controversial and difficult, particularly for the cultural sector, because the types of methods that fit in well with cost-benefit analysis, so the types of methods that might involve asking people what their particular economic preferences are, asking people to give, say, prices for experiences that maybe don't have prices attached to them, or trying to understand the relationship between people's incomes and their well-being, and then deriving prices from that relationship, or very crudely doing things like counting attendances and trying to synthesize prices from comparable private sector ticket costs for, say, the entrance into a museum. Or, and this is the kind of controversial and difficult bit, fitting in the experiential, economic or social impacts within a cost-benefit analysis have all been heavily criticised within the cultural value debate. And so the kind of discussions that were going on in the mid-2000s around intrinsic and instrumental impacts, the kinds of discussions that were happening in Jal's paper and the Demos work, are all, should we say, sceptical about these particular tools for a variety of different reasons. And these reasons are quite kind of interesting. I'll just skip that, because they bring us back, I think, to a kind of disciplinary and also a disciplinary debate, but also a power relationship too. This is a quote from an American economist who's written an interesting book about American cultural funding called Tyler Cowen, who talks about the possible incommensurability of things like Shakespeare's plays, both in themselves, you know, which is better, Lear, Julius Caesar, or Macbeth, or comparing Shakespeare's plays across art forms to say who is the more, not to put it crudely, but who would be the more deserving of funding from the modern Treasury regime, Shakespeare or Gershwin? And to go back to my kind of opening slide, should we be funding computer game developers who will have commercial impacts in the market, or should we be developing avant-garde digital artists whose work may feed in to commercial impacts in an unclear or uncertain way? These sort of schools of thought, I think, have a long-standing story behind them that really emerges at the beginning of the 19th century with the kind of state-building project and the emergence of Victorian modernity in the UK, and the emergence later in the 19th century of nation-states across Europe, and the kind of bringing together on the one hand of national cultures, and on the other hand particular technologies of state building, like the birth of statistics, the emergence of bureaucracies, goes hand in hand with the carving out of the aesthetic realm as being somehow separate, different, unique, special, in a way that can be distanced from both the market and bureaucracy. And it's interesting to sort of chart this emergence of the kind of uniqueness or specialness of the cultural or aesthetic realm as it goes through a kind of distance from bureaucracy, the idea that bureaucracy would be about routine, about standardization, about being governed by instrumental rationality, and creativity, culture, and the aesthetic would be about the particular, the spontaneous, the kind of unpredictable, that which can never be captured by routinization, which is the core of the bureaucratic process, whilst at the same time being distant from the market in terms of being unsubordinated to the demands of commercial concerns, these concerns of what would sell, and concerns about perhaps what would be acceptable to those willing to pay the highest price. Now, this sort of expresses itself quite a lot, actually, in both the kind of comment I showed you from Cowan about, well, how do you make Shakespeare commensurable with Gershwin, but also in a lot of the strands of thinking that have come up in the debates about cultural value. And we see various discourses that tell us how culture, aesthetics, the art world are separate from the market and cannot be captured or tamed by bureaucracies. When in actual fact, this is a sort of story that has become useful within debates, within the, dare I say, the kind of special pleading that Geordie kind of drew our attention to and cautioned us against. As we see with sociology of art, actually art and the market are kind of interdependent, and the discourses of art for art's sake or art's uniqueness or specialness play out in interesting ways when we get to the art gallery, the art dealership, and the complex interplay of the price or the economic value of a particular artifact and its position within a broader art historical narrative, which we might describe as its cultural value. Equally, the kind of tools and techniques that were the foundation of the nation state and bureaucracy were the very same tools and techniques, particularly things like map making and the kind of aesthetic aspects of nation building, and the sort of standardization of things like common languages, which allowed the emergence of kind of mass practices of novel reading. These techniques are the kind of techniques that culture itself, the aesthetic realm, the art world, is dependent on, and it's difficult to separate the emergence of mass culture from the emergence of the bureaucratic nation state, with which kind of modern cultural activity really tries to kind of keep itself separate from, distant to, or differentiate itself from. Now, that story, I suppose, of, on the one hand, the kind of complex interrelationship between markets, states and culture, the different disciplinary perspectives that are going on underneath that, and perhaps the kind of incommensurability of these disciplinary perspectives and stories with one another, play out in a really interesting way within central government. So I've done some work with policymakers in the Ministry of Culture to try and understand how they use evidence and how evidence kind of becomes real. And it's fascinating the way that you can detect in their discussions, whether as social scientists in government, as policymakers in government, or as those parts of the British cultural system that are the kind of liaisons between individual artists, institutions and the government, how messy the policy process is, and how different narratives, different types of evidence kind of come up, get used, and are used perhaps in sort of inconsistent ways within a constant attempt to professionalise, standardise and make clear, transparent, and again I'll use this term kind of follow on from Geordie, to make this kind of process accountable to the public who they're meant to serve. So ministerial influence is really important, but as is the influence of scrutiny, transparency and accountability, particularly around legal regimes of how statistics can be used, particularly around legal regimes of reporting to Parliament, And evidence becomes part of kind of grander stories about how we'll tell the story of our policy making to the press and to the public and to particular clients. And timing, of course, is absolutely everything. And within the discussion of evidence, not just ministerial influence or the messiness of telling policy stories to public media and other parts of Westminster, but there is also a kind of a strong recognition of the hierarchical nature of evidence within the professionalised positivist system of policy making demanded by the Treasury. But this is not done in a kind of should we say, explicitly gaming kind of way, that policymakers didn't talk about evidence and the kind of distinctions between qualitative and quantitative forms of evidence and the hierarchy of quantitative evidence as being kind of better, more useful, more appropriate in a way that kind of allows them to game the system or allows them to get more money. They talked about it in terms of a common sense, which I found particularly interesting, that large data sets would be the common sense way of understanding the social, because the social is about aggregates. That if we're dealing with questions about efficiency and value for money, economics would be the common sense discipline to draw on, rather than the sort of art history or sociology or broader social science disciplines that had given us the ideas about maybe a funding choices relationship to an art historical canon, or a funding choices relationship to impact on individual or community experiences. And so it's really sort of difficult to separate out these hierarchies of evidence within both the kind of broader story of Whitehall's professionalisation and its turn to economics, but also to separate them out, I think, from the kind of policy-making narratives that have kind of come up in the cultural sector over the last sort of 20 or 30 years or so, as we see the tensions between, on the one hand, economics, on the other hand, maybe sociology of culture, and finally, art history and the sort of the aesthetic disciplines that we might associate with the humanities. As a sort of form of conclusion, I'd like to turn to a quote from Nick Rose, who is a kind of, I guess he's a sort of maybe sociologist of science, who has talked a lot about the kind of the power of numbers and the sort of the way numbers might be used to make particular political decisions seem accountable, seem transparent, and seem as if they have been done in a bureaucratic fashion. And I think there's always the sort of the danger that we'd forget the power relationships that go into the common sense discussions of numbers within Westminster, but also the sort of power relationships that we might find analogously in the common sense discussions that go on amongst art historians and go on amongst the cultural studies disciplines. There's a problem of sort of getting accurate numbers. Where can we get, the kind of the right figures for how many people have attended a museum? Where can we get the right figures for the costs of that museum as compared to maybe other costs across Whitehall? And there is a sort of a danger that we'd sort of place our trust in numbers as the kind of policymakers do, as a form of common sense, and make democracy a kind of technical exercise. But the flip side to that is not to say that we should sort of abandon the professionalisation process that has drawn on positivistic economics, but rather to say that the question of common sense that would come from trying to perhaps maybe unveil the power relationships that go on amongst many of the discourses and narratives that dominate policy making in this area might give us a clearer idea of the politics of cultural value, as opposed to just either the sort of common sense of art history, the common sense of cultural studies, and the common sense of economics. Thank you.